The old concert hall smelled like polished wood and history. Every night at 11, when the last patron walked out and the heavy doors clicked shut, Thomas would pull his cleaning cart from the storage room and begin his routine. He'd worked here for 15 years now, mopping the same marble floors, dusting the same velvet seats, and wiping down the same brass railings that spiraled up to the balcony seats. Most people didn't notice janitors. Thomas had learned that long ago. He could walk through a crowd of well-dressed concert-goers, and their eyes would simply slide past him as if he were invisible. That was fine by him. He preferred the quiet anyway, the peaceful hours after midnight when the building was his alone. But there was one thing in that entire building that Thomas never quite felt alone with. The grand piano. It sat center stage under a single spotlight that the crew always forgot to turn off, and every night Thomas found himself drawn to it like a moth to flame. He wasn't supposed to touch it. That was understood, even though nobody had ever said it out loud. The piano was for the professionals, the ones who'd studied at fancy schools and performed in cities around the world. Not for someone like him, a man who'd barely finished high school and spent his days emptying trash bins and scrubbing toilets. But Thomas did touch it. Every single night. It started small, maybe 5 years back. He'd been cleaning the stage and his hand had accidentally brushed across the keys. The sound that came out was so pure, so alive that it startled him. He'd looked around guiltily, even though he knew he was alone. Then he'd pressed another key, and another. From that night on, his cleaning routine always ended the same way. He'd save the stage for last, take his time wiping down the floor around the piano, and then, when everything else was spotless, he'd sit on that bench for just a few minutes. At first, he only played random notes, listening to how they echoed through the empty hall. But Thomas had something most people didn't realize. He had good ears and even better memory. Every evening before his shift started, he'd arrive 30 minutes early and sit in the back row during rehearsals. He'd watch the pianist's hands, memorizing which keys they pressed and in what order. He couldn't read sheet music, had never taken a lesson in his life, but he could copy what he saw. Slowly, note by note, he taught himself to play. His collection of songs was nothing fancy. Children's melodies mostly, the kind his mother used to hum when he was small. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star was the first complete song he learned. It took him 3 months to get it right, and when he finally played it all the way through without mistakes, he'd actually laughed out loud, the sound bouncing off the empty walls. After that came other simple tunes, folk songs he remembered from childhood, a few basic classical pieces he'd heard performed so many times he knew them by heart. He wasn't good, not by any professional standard. His fingers were stiff from years of manual labor, and his timing wasn't always perfect. But when he played, something inside him felt lighter. The truth was, Thomas's life wasn't easy. It never had been. His mother had gotten sick when he was 17, some disease the doctors couldn't quite figure out but kept getting worse. He'd dropped out of school to take care of her and pick up work wherever he could find it. The concert hall job came along when he was 23, and he'd been here ever since. These days, his mother needed round-the-clock care. The medical bills were crushing, even with insurance. Thomas worked a second job during the day, stocking shelves at a grocery store, catching sleep in whatever hours remained. He was 42 years old and felt twice that, but the piano, those stolen moments at midnight, they were his escape. When his fingers touched those keys, he wasn't a tired janitor with an aching back and a bank account that never quite stretched to the end of the month. He was something else. Someone else. For those few precious minutes, he was free. He never played for long, 20 minutes at most. He lived in fear that someone would come back, that the security guard would hear, that he'd get in trouble. So he played softly, barely above a whisper, and he always kept one ear listening for footsteps. Thomas knew he wasn't a real pianist. Real pianists had studied for years, could read complicated music, understood theory and technique. They wore nice clothes and took bows while audiences clapped. They belonged in places like this. He was just borrowing time with an instrument that would never truly be his. Sometimes late at night, he'd imagine a different life, one where he'd had the chance to take lessons as a kid, where money hadn't been so tight, where his mother hadn't gotten sick. Maybe in that life, he could have been one of those people on stage, playing for crowds instead of cleaning up after them. But those were just dreams, and Thomas had learned long ago that dreams didn't pay bills or put food on the table. Still, he couldn't stop. Every night after he'd cleaned everything else, he'd sit at that piano. His rough, calloused hands would rest on the smooth keys and he'd play his simple songs. Sometimes he'd try to add his own little changes, a different note here or there, experimenting with what sounded good together. The other janitors thought he was strange for taking so long on the stage area. "Why do you spend so much time up there?" one had asked him once. Thomas had just shrugged, said he wanted to make sure it was perfect. They'd accepted that answer and stopped asking. Nobody knew about the music. It was his secret, his private joy in a life that didn't have many joys. On this particular night, Thomas finished his usual routine. He'd mopped the lobby, cleaned the bathrooms, vacuumed the aisles between seats. The stage was last as always. He pushed his cart up the side stairs, his knees creaking a bit with each step. Getting older, he thought, feeling it more every day. The piano waited for him under its spotlight, gleaming and beautiful. Thomas set down his cleaning supplies and approached it slowly, the way someone might approach something sacred. He sat on the bench, positioned his hands, and began to play. Tonight it was "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," the song that started it all. His fingers moved across the keys and the simple melody filled the empty hall. He played it the way he'd been practicing lately, with small variations he'd invented himself, trying to make it more interesting, more his own. Thomas closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. For these few minutes, nothing else existed. Not the bills waiting at home, not his mother's illness, not his exhausted body or his uncertain future. Just the music, pure and simple and true. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He didn't know that tomorrow would bring cameras and laughter and humiliation. He couldn't have guessed that this simple song, this children's melody he played alone in an empty hall, would eventually move thousands of people to tears. Tonight, he was just Thomas, a janitor who loved music, playing piano in the dark. The night started like any other Thursday. Thomas arrived at the concert hall at 10:30, changed into his work uniform in the small janitor's closet, and waited for the evening's event to wrap up. Tonight was something special, though he didn't pay much attention to the details. Some kind of fundraising gala for the arts. Lots of wealthy donors and famous musicians mingling in expensive clothes. He'd seen hundreds of these events over the years. They all blurred together after a while. By 11:15, the main crowd had moved to the reception hall on the other side of the building. Thomas could hear the distant murmur of conversation and clinking glasses as he started his cleaning routine. He worked his way through the lobby, taking his time, waiting for everyone to clear out completely before he headed to the stage. Around midnight, the reception hall went quiet. Thomas figured everyone had finally left. The security guard, old Pete, had probably already done his rounds and settled into his office to watch his late-night shows. The building felt empty, peaceful, just the way Thomas liked it. He pushed his cart up to the stage, his heart already beating a little faster in anticipation. This was his favorite part of the day, the moment he looked forward to through all the long, exhausting hours. He set his supplies aside and approached the piano. The spotlight was on, as usual. Thomas sat down on the bench and stretched his fingers. They were sore tonight from unloading heavy boxes at the grocery store that morning, but they'd loosen up once he started playing. He decided on "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" again. He'd been working on a new variation, adding some deeper notes that made it sound richer, more complex. It wasn't anything a real musician would be impressed by, but Thomas was proud of what he'd figured out on his own. His fingers touched the keys, and the first notes rang out into the empty hall. Thomas closed his eyes, letting himself sink into the music. He played slowly, carefully, adding his little changes where he'd practiced them. The simple melody transformed under his hands, becoming something more than just a children's song. He was so focused on the music that he didn't hear them at first. Didn't notice the footsteps or the whispered voices. He was lost in his own world, in those precious stolen moments where nothing else mattered. "Oh my God, is that the janitor?" The voice cut through the music like a knife. Thomas's hands froze on the keys, his eyes snapping open. His stomach dropped. There, in the wings of the stage, stood a group of 5 young people. They couldn't have been older than 25, all dressed in elegant concert attire. Thomas recognized the type immediately. The young prodigy musicians who sometimes performed at the hall. Their faces were a mix of amusement and disbelief. "He's playing Twinkle. Twinkle, Little Star," another one said, and they all burst out laughing. Thomas stood up quickly, nearly knocking over the bench. His face burned with embarrassment. I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was still here, No, please continue, one of them said. A tall young man with perfectly styled hair and an expensive-looking suit. His tone dripped with mockery. This is fascinating. We came back to get Vincent's jacket and stumbled onto a private concert. The others laughed again. Thomas noticed one of them holding up a phone, the camera pointed directly at him. His heart sank even further. Please don't, Thomas said quietly. I wasn't supposed to, I'm sorry, I'll go. But you were doing so well, the tall one continued, stepping closer. His smile was cruel, the kind that came from someone who'd never known real struggle. Tell me, do you take requests? Maybe Mary had a little lamb for an encore. The group howled with laughter. Thomas felt small, insignificant. All those years of practice, all those private moments of joy suddenly felt foolish and pathetic. What's your name? The tall one asked. Thomas, he answered barely above a whisper. Well, Thomas, I'm Brett. I've performed at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, venues around the world, and I have to say, he paused dramatically, that was the most adorable thing I've ever seen. Did you teach yourself? Watch some YouTube videos? I watched the rehearsals, Thomas admitted, not sure why he was even answering. I memorize what I see. That's precious, Brett said. Really it is. But here's the thing, Thomas. This instrument, this stage, they're not for people like you. They're for artists. For people who've dedicated their lives to the craft. Not for someone who cleans up after us and plays nursery rhymes when he thinks nobody's watching. Each word felt like a slap. Thomas wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor. Brett, come on, we should go, one of the women in the group said, though she was still smiling. In a minute, Brett said. He walked up to the piano and sat down. Let me show you what real music sounds like. His hands flew across the keys and suddenly the hall filled with complex, beautiful music. Some classical piece Thomas didn't know the name of. Brett played it flawlessly, his fingers moving so fast they were almost a blur. It was incredible, perfect, everything Thomas knew he could never be. When Brett finished, he stood up and gave a mock bow. That's what this piano is for. Not for. He gestured at Thomas dismissively. Whatever that was. Got it all, the one with the phone said, grinning. This is going to be hilarious. Wait, please, Thomas said, panic rising in his chest. Don't post that. I could lose my job, Brett shrugged. Should have thought of that before you decided to play pretend pianist. Come on, guys. Let's get out of here. They left, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Thomas stood there alone on the stage, shaking. He felt sick, humiliated, angry at himself for being caught, for being stupid enough to think he could do this. He quickly gathered his cleaning supplies and finished his work in a daze. His hands trembled as he mopped, and he couldn't stop replaying the scene in his mind. The mockery in Brett's voice, the laughter, the camera phone recording his embarrassment. When Thomas got home that night, it was nearly 3 a.m. His mother was asleep, the night nurse reading a book by her bedside. Thomas went to his small room and lay down on the bed without even taking off his shoes. He didn't sleep much. He kept thinking about what had happened, hoping against hope that they wouldn't actually post the video, that it would just be a mean joke between them. But when Thomas woke up a few hours later and checked his phone, his worst fears had come true. The video was everywhere. It had been posted on social media with the caption, "Janitor thinks he's a concert pianist. Found this guy playing Twinkle Twinkle on a $200,000 piano. Stick to the mop, buddy." Thomas watched the video with growing horror. There he was, playing his simple tune, his work uniform clearly visible, his face full of concentration. Then Brett's voice cutting in, the laughter, Thomas's stammered apology. They'd edited it to make him look even more pathetic, adding laughing emojis and exaggerated zoom-ins on his face. The video had been shared thousands of times already. The comments were brutal. This is so cringe. Someone tell Grandpa to stick to his day job. Imagine thinking you can play piano just by watching people. That's not how it works. The audacity of this man touching that expensive instrument with his janitor hands. Thomas's phone buzzed with notifications. People were finding his social media account, sending him messages. Most were cruel. A few were pitying, which somehow felt worse. He sat there on his bed, phone in his shaking hands, watching his most private joy become a public joke. 15 years of secret practice of finding peace in music, reduced to entertainment for strangers on the internet. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his supervisor at the concert hall. "We need to talk. Come to my office before your shift tonight." Thomas put the phone down and stared at the ceiling. Everything was falling apart. And the worst part was he couldn't even be angry at Brett and his friends. They were right, weren't they? Who was he to touch that piano? Who was he to think he could make music? Just a janitor who'd forgotten his place. Thomas arrived at the concert hall 2 hours early that evening. His stomach had been in knots all day and he'd barely eaten anything. The video had continued spreading overnight, and by morning it had been picked up by several entertainment blogs. "Janitor's piano dreams go viral," one headline read. Another said, "When watching isn't enough, the man who couldn't stay in his lane." He found his supervisor, Mr. Patterson, waiting in the small administrative office. The older man's face was stern and he didn't offer Thomas a seat. "I'm going to be direct with you," Mr. Patterson said, closing the door. "The board is very concerned about this situation. That piano is worth more than most people's houses. You were explicitly hired to clean, not to use the equipment." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." Mr. Patterson sighed, rubbing his temples. "The problem is bigger than that now. We've had donors calling asking questions. Some think it's funny, but others are worried about liability, about the image of the hall. And honestly, Thomas, you've put me in a difficult position. I've always liked you. You're reliable, you do good work. But this—" "I understand if you need to let me go," Thomas said, though the words hurt coming out. He needed this job desperately. The insurance it provided was the only thing keeping his mother in decent care. "I'm not firing you," Mr. Patterson said after a long pause, "but there are conditions. You stay away from the instruments. All of them. You stick to your assigned cleaning duties, nothing more. And if this becomes a bigger problem, if it affects our reputation with donors, we'll have to revisit this conversation. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." "Crystal clear. Good, now get to work." Thomas left the office feeling hollow. He should have been relieved to keep his job, but all he felt was shame. He went through his cleaning routine like a robot, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The other staff members had seen the video too. Some gave him sympathetic looks. Others whispered and laughed when they thought he couldn't hear. When he reached the stage that night, Thomas couldn't even look at the piano. He cleaned around it quickly, keeping his distance, and moved on as fast as he could. The next few weeks were torture. The video kept resurfacing on different platforms. People created memes using his face. Someone made a remix of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," with his image photoshopped onto various famous pianists. A late-night comedy show even did a bit about it. Strangers recognized him on the street. Most just stared or pointed. A few approached him to take selfies, treating him like some kind of novelty act. One teenager filmed him at the grocery store where he worked his day job, narrating, "Look, it's the piano janitor. Play us something on the cash register." Thomas stopped going out except for work and necessary errands. He deleted his social media accounts, but the harassment found other ways to reach him. Someone left a toy piano on his doorstep with a note that said, "More your speed." The grocery store manager asked him to work in the back room, away from customers because his presence was becoming a distraction. Every night, Thomas drove home exhausted and defeated. The music that had once brought him joy now felt like a source of pain. He couldn't even listen to the radio without feeling a pang of loss and humiliation. But the worst part was lying to his mother. She was getting sicker. The doctors had stopped talking about treatments and started talking about comfort. She spent most of her days in bed now, the medication keeping her in a fog. But she still had moments of clarity, and in those moments she could read Thomas like a book. "Something's wrong," she said one evening. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were sharp. "You've been different lately. Distant." "I'm just tired, Mom," Thomas said, adjusting her pillows. "Work's been busy." "Don't lie to your mother," she said with a small smile. "I'm dying, not blind." "What happened?" Thomas hesitated. He'd kept the whole thing from her, not wanting to add to her burdens. But looking at her now, at how frail she'd become, he realized he couldn't keep carrying this alone. So he told her everything. About the piano, about teaching himself to play, about being caught and mocked and turned into an internet joke. He told her about the shame, about how stupid he felt, about how something he'd loved had been ruined. His mother listened quietly, her thin hand holding his. When he finished, tears were running down his cheeks. He hadn't meant to cry, but once he started, he couldn't stop. "Oh, my sweet boy," she said softly. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you remember your father?" Thomas nodded. His father had died when he was 6. He had vague memories, scattered images and feelings more than concrete details. "Your father was a musician," his mother said. "Did I ever tell you that?" Thomas looked up surprised. "No, you never talked about him much." "He played guitar on street corners," she continued, her voice distant with memory. "He was good too. Really good. People would stop and listen for hours. But his family, they thought it was shameful. They wanted him to get a real job, to be practical. They mocked him constantly, told him he was wasting his life, that music wouldn't put food on the table." She paused, catching her breath. The effort of talking was clearly tiring her, but she pressed on. Eventually, their words got to him. He gave up music entirely, took a factory job he hated. The guitar went into the closet and never came out again. And you know what? He was miserable, absolutely miserable. He died at 35 from a heart attack, probably from all the stress and unhappiness he kept bottled up inside. Thomas's hand tightened around hers. "Before he died, he made me promise something," his mother said. "He made me promise that if we ever had children, I'd never let anyone tell them they couldn't do what they loved. That I'd teach them to value their own hearts over other people's opinions." She reached for the drawer of her bedside table, her movements weak and shaky. Thomas helped her open it. Inside was a small box he'd never seen before. She pulled out an old pocket watch tarnished with age. "This was your father's," she said, pressing it into Thomas's palm. "Open it." Thomas clicked the watch open. Inside the cover was an inscription in faded handwriting. "Music lives in the heart, not the hands." He wrote that the day he stopped playing, his mother said, as a reminder of what he'd lost. But I think he meant it differently than he knew. Music isn't about perfection, Thomas. It's not about having the right training or playing in the right places or impressing the right people. It's about what you feel here. She placed her hand over her heart. Those people who laughed at you, they don't understand that. They think music belongs to them, to their kind. But your father knew better, and I know better. Music belongs to anyone who feels it. And from what you've told me, you feel it deeply. But Mom, I'm not good enough, Thomas said. I'm just a janitor who plays simple songs. And your father was just a street musician who played for spare change, she replied. But when he played, people cried. When he played, the world felt different for a few minutes. That's what real music does. It doesn't matter if it's complex or simple, if it's in a concert hall or on a street corner. What matters is if it's true. She was getting tired now, her eyelids drooping. But she squeezed his hand one more time. Don't let them take this from you, she whispered. Don't make your father's mistake. Promise me. I promise, Thomas said, though he wasn't sure he believed it yet. His mother died 3 days later. It was peaceful in the early morning with Thomas holding her hand. The grief was overwhelming, but mixed in with it was something else. A small, stubborn spark that refused to go out. At the funeral, Thomas put the pocket watch in his breast pocket right over his heart. He could feel it there throughout the service, a small weight that felt like responsibility and permission all at once. That night, Thomas stood outside the concert hall at the end of his shift. Everyone had gone home. The stage was empty, the piano waiting under its spotlight. Mr. Patterson's words echoed in his head. Stay away from the instruments, but so did his mother's words. Don't let them take this from you. Thomas walked to the piano. He sat down on the bench, and for the first time in weeks he placed his hands on the keys. They felt like coming home. 2 months passed after his mother's funeral. Thomas went through his days in a fog, working both jobs, coming home to an empty apartment that still smelled faintly of her medication and lavender soap. The grief was a constant weight in his chest, but so was the pocket watch he carried everywhere, its presence a reminder of promises made and promises kept. He played the piano again, though not every night. Just once or twice a week, late after his shift when he was certain the building was empty. He was more careful now, listening for footsteps, checking the security camera schedules. But he couldn't stop completely. His mother's words had planted something in him that refused to die, even when everything else felt dark. Then one Tuesday morning, Thomas arrived at work to find a buzz of activity in the administrative offices. People were hanging banners and there was an excitement in the air he hadn't seen before. He caught glimpses of a poster as he passed by. 50th Anniversary Community Showcase. During his lunch break, Thomas stopped to read the full announcement on the bulletin board. The concert hall was celebrating 50 years, and as part of the festivities, they were opening the stage to the community. Anyone could audition for a chance to perform. 5-minute slots, amateur musicians, local talent, ordinary people with extraordinary passion. A celebration of music in all its forms, the poster read. Because art belongs to everyone. Thomas stared at those words for a long time. Art belongs to everyone. He touched the pocket watch through his shirt, feeling its outline against his chest. Could he really do this? Step onto that stage not as a joke or an accident, but intentionally? In front of hundreds of people? The thought terrified him. He walked away from the poster, trying to forget about it. But over the next few days, he kept coming back to it. The audition deadline was in 2 weeks. All he had to do was submit a simple application form, just his name, contact information, and a brief description of what he'd perform. Thomas filled out the form 3 times and threw it away 3 times. On the 4th try, he wrote his name at the top and stopped. His hand was shaking. This was insane. People would recognize him. They'd laugh. Brett and his friends would probably be there. The video would resurface. He'd humiliate himself all over again, but worse this time because he'd have done it on purpose. But then he thought about his father, giving up his guitar and dying miserable. He thought about his mother's final words. Don't let them take this from you. Thomas finished the form and dropped it in the submission box before he could change his mind again. He didn't expect to hear back. Surely they'd have hundreds of applicants, maybe thousands. Surely they'd pick actually talented people, not internet jokes who played children's songs. But 3 days later, his phone rang with a call from the concert hall's events coordinator. Mr. Thomas, we'd love to include you in our community showcase. Your application was quite moving, and we think your story represents exactly what this event is about. Would you be available for the performance on the 28th? Thomas could barely speak. Yes, he managed. Yes, I'll be there. Wonderful. We'll send you the details. And Mr. Thomas, we're glad you're giving music another chance. After he hung up, Thomas sat down heavily on his couch. He was really doing this. In 3 weeks, he'd be on that stage playing piano in front of a full audience. The reality of it hit him like a wave, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. Then his phone started buzzing with notifications. Someone had leaked the performer list online. And of course, Thomas's name had been spotted immediately. Within hours, the story was everywhere again. Remember the janitor who got mocked for playing piano? He's performing at the hall's anniversary show. The comments section was predictably brutal. Hundreds of people saying he was setting himself up for more embarrassment. Others calling it a publicity stunt. A few defended him, but they were drowned out by the mockery, and then Brett himself posted about it. Absolutely hilarious that Riverside Concert Hall is letting anyone with a mop touch their stage now, he wrote. I'm genuinely embarrassed for this institution. What's next, letting kindergartners perform? This man was a joke 3 months ago, and now they're rewarding him for it. Standards have officially died. I'll be there opening night to witness this disaster firsthand. His post was shared thousands of times. Other professional musicians chimed in, some agreeing with Brett, others calling him cruel. The debate raged online, and Thomas found himself at the center of it once again, except this time he'd volunteered for the attention. What had he been thinking? The local news picked up the story. A reporter even showed up at the grocery store where Thomas worked, asking for an interview. He declined, but they ran a story anyway, calling it the comeback nobody asked for. Thomas stopped reading the comments after the first few days. There was no point. People had already made up their minds about him. He was either a brave underdog or a delusional fool, depending on who you asked. The night after Brett's post went viral, Thomas stood in his small apartment and seriously considered backing out. He could call the events coordinator, make up an excuse, disappear before the humiliation. Nobody would blame him, but then he pulled out his mother's pocket watch and opened it. Music lives in the heart, not the hands. If he backed out now, Brett would win. Not just Brett, but everyone who'd ever said that music belonged only to certain people, to the trained and the privileged and the perfect. And more importantly, he'd be breaking his promise to his mother. Thomas made a decision that night. He wasn't going to just show up and play. He was going to practice like his life depended on it. He was going to pour everything he had into those 5 minutes. He couldn't use the concert hall anymore, not with the increased security and his supervisor's warning. So he found a church 3 blocks from his apartment that left their doors unlocked. The old piano in their basement was out of tune and missing a few keys, but it was something. Every day after his shifts, Thomas went to that church basement. He practiced for hours, his fingers moving over the keys until they ached. He'd decided on his program, a simple medley starting with Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star, the song that had started everything, flowing into his mother's favorite lullaby, and ending with something he'd been working on in secret for years. A small piece he'd composed himself. It wasn't technically complex. Any trained pianist could probably play it after looking at sheet music for 5 minutes. But Thomas had put his whole heart into creating it. Every note a reflection of his life, his struggles, his grief, his joy, his hope. He practiced it until he could play it with his eyes closed. Until the music felt like breathing. He worked on his dynamics, making the soft parts softer and the loud parts stronger. He experimented with tempo, finding the right pace that made the emotion land. The church pastor found him one evening, sitting at the piano in the dim basement light. "You're the one everyone's talking about," the pastor said kindly. "The video?" Thomas nodded, tensing for judgment or mockery. "It's beautiful," the pastor said simply. "What you're playing now, it's really beautiful. Keep practicing. I think you're going to surprise a lot of people." Those words meant more to Thomas than the pastor probably realized. It was the first genuinely kind thing a stranger had said to him in months. As the performance date approached, Thomas's anxiety grew. He barely slept. He ran through the piece in his mind constantly, his fingers moving involuntarily against tables and countertops. He lost weight from nerves, his work uniform hanging looser than before. The night before the performance, Thomas stood in his apartment holding the pocket watch. His mother's funeral photo sat on the shelf, and he looked at it for a long time. "I hope I make you proud," he whispered. He didn't sleep at all that night, just lay in bed running through the music in his head, imagining the moment he'd walk onto that stage. Would people boo? Would they laugh? Would Brett stand up and mock him in front of everyone? Maybe, probably. But Thomas was going to play anyway. Not for them. Not for vindication or revenge or to prove anything to the people who'd mocked him. He was playing for his mother. For his father. For everyone who'd ever been told they weren't good enough, that they should stay in their lane, that beauty and art weren't meant for people like them. He was playing because music lived in his heart. And nothing anyone said could take that away. The next evening, Thomas put on the only suit he owned, a cheap one he'd bought for his mother's funeral. He tucked the pocket watch into his breast pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely button his shirt. It was time. The concert hall was packed. Thomas had never seen it this full, not in all his 15 years working there. Every seat was taken and people lined the walls in the back. Some had come to support the community performers. Others had come for the spectacle, to see if the janitor would crash and burn. Thomas waited backstage with the other performers, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. His hands were ice cold despite the warmth of the building. He could hear the murmur of the crowd, could feel their energy through the heavy curtain. He peeked out from behind the stage and immediately spotted Brett. The young pianist sat in the 3rd row, center seat, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. Several other professional musicians sat around him, probably his friends from that night. They were all watching the stage with expressions that ranged from amusement to disdain. Thomas's stomach churned. He touched the pocket watch in his breast pocket, trying to steady himself. The community showcase had already been running for an hour. A teenage girl had played violin beautifully. An elderly man had performed a jazz number on saxophone that brought the house down. A children's choir had sung with pure, clear voices that made people smile. The audience was warm, supportive, clapping enthusiastically for each performer. But Thomas knew his reception would be different. He was the controversial one, the internet joke, the man who'd been mocked worldwide. Half the people here probably thought he shouldn't be allowed on stage at all. "Thomas, you're up next," the stage manager whispered, touching his shoulder. This was it. No turning back now. Thomas walked to the edge of the stage, waiting for his cue. His legs felt weak. His mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to disappear, to avoid the humiliation that was surely coming. Then the Announcer's voice rang out. Our next performer is Thomas playing a piano medley. The crowd's reaction was immediate and mixed. Some people clapped politely, others whispered. Thomas heard a few laughs. As he walked onto the stage, he saw Brett lean over to say something to his friends, and they all chuckled. The walk to the piano felt like miles. The spotlight was blindingly bright. Thomas could barely see the audience beyond the first few rows, which was probably a blessing. He sat down on the bench, and for a moment, he couldn't remember how to position his hands. The hall fell silent, waiting, judging. Thomas closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought about his mother, about her smile when she told him stories about his father. He thought about the pocket watch pressed against his chest. He thought about all those nights, alone in this hall, playing for no one but himself, finding peace in the music. This moment wasn't about Brett or the internet or proving anyone wrong. It was about honoring a promise. It was about refusing to let fear win. Thomas opened his eyes and placed his fingers on the keys. The first notes of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" rang out into the silent hall. He heard a snicker from somewhere in the audience. Someone whispered something that sounded mocking. But Thomas kept playing. He played the simple melody slowly, deliberately, letting each note breathe. Then he began to add his variations, the ones he'd practiced for years. Lower notes that gave the children's song depth, small changes in rhythm that made it feel less like a nursery rhyme and more like a meditation. The whispers stopped. Thomas transitioned smoothly into his mother's favorite lullaby. This one he played softer, more gently, like a prayer. He remembered singing it to her in her final days, remembered how her face would relax when she heard it. The grief was still fresh, still raw, and he let it flow through his fingers into the keys. Somewhere in the audience, someone sniffled. Thomas didn't rush. He let the lullaby say what words couldn't. Let it carry the weight of love and loss and memory. When the last note faded, he paused for just a moment, gathering himself for the final piece. Then he began his own composition, the piece he'd written slowly over years, adding to it bit by bit during those midnight sessions. It started quiet, almost hesitant, like someone afraid to speak. Then it grew, gaining confidence, becoming bolder. The melody climbed and fell, twisted and resolved, carrying with it every emotion Thomas had lived through: joy and sorrow, hope and despair, dignity in the face of mockery, beauty in the midst of struggle. His rough, calloused hands moved across the keys, and something magical happened. The notes stopped being just sounds and became something else entirely. They became a story, a journey, a human heart laid bare for everyone to witness. Thomas was no longer thinking about technique or mistakes. He wasn't thinking at all. He was simply feeling, and letting those feelings pour out through the music. Years of pain, years of joy, years of secret dreams and quiet perseverance, all of it channeled into these 5 minutes. The hall was completely silent now except for the piano. No whispers, no shuffling, no coughs. Just hundreds of people holding their breath, caught up in something they hadn't expected. Thomas built to the final crescendo, his hands stretching across the keys, the music swelling to fill every corner of that massive hall. Then, slowly, gently, he brought it back down, softer and softer, like a light dimming, until the last note was barely a whisper. He held it there for a long moment, his foot on the pedal, letting it fade naturally into silence. Then it was over. Thomas lifted his hands from the keys and sat very still, almost afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. The silence stretched on. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then someone started clapping. It wasn't polite applause. It was thunderous. Within moments, the entire hall was on its feet. The sound was deafening, overwhelming. People weren't just clapping, they were cheering. Thomas looked up, stunned, and saw faces in the crowd. Many were crying. Not just a few people, but dozens, hundreds maybe, wiping their eyes and applauding like they'd witnessed something profound. In the third row, Brett wasn't smirking anymore. He was standing with everyone else and tears were running down his face. His hands came together in slow, deliberate claps, his expression one of complete shock and humility. The applause went on and on. 5 minutes, someone would later tell Thomas, though it felt like both an eternity and an instant. The stage manager finally had to come out and gently gesture that they needed to move on with the program. Thomas stood and gave a small, awkward bow. He wasn't used to this, to being seen, to being celebrated. As he walked off stage, his legs were shaking, but this time not from fear. Backstage, other performers hugged him. Strangers congratulated him. Someone handed him water because they thought he looked overwhelmed. He was. But the biggest surprise came 10 minutes later when Brett found him. The young pianist approached slowly, hesitantly. His eyes were red from crying. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. Thomas tensed, expecting another cruel joke, another humiliation. "I'm sorry," Brett said, and his voice cracked. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you. That night, the video, all of it. I was arrogant and cruel and I thought music belonged to people like me. But what you just did up there?" He shook his head, wiping his eyes. "That was real. That was more honest and beautiful than anything I've ever played in my life. You showed me what music actually is. Not perfection, not technique, but truth. I'm sorry." Thomas didn't know what to say. He'd imagined this moment going 1,000 different ways, but never like this. "I forgive you," he finally said, because his mother had taught him about grace, and because holding on to anger would only hurt himself. Brett nodded, squeezed Thomas's shoulder, and walked away. The video of Thomas's performance went viral, just like the first one had. But this time, the comments were different. People shared it with messages about courage, about the power of art, about how music can come from anywhere and anyone. Professional musicians analyzed his playing, not to mock it, but to discuss the emotional depth he'd achieved with simple techniques. A music teacher from a prestigious conservatory reached out, offering Thomas a scholarship for adult students. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell his story. Dozens of news outlets requested interviews. But the moment that mattered most to Thomas came 3 days after the performance. He was at the concert hall, back in his janitor's uniform, cleaning the stage like always. Mr. Patterson found him there. "The board met this morning," his supervisor said. "They want to offer you something. We'd like you to stay on as janitor if you want. But we're also creating a new position, community music coordinator. You'd teach free piano lessons here twice a week to anyone who wants to learn. Kids, adults, anyone, no experience necessary." Thomas stared at him, unable to process the words. "We should have offered you something like this years ago," Mr. Patterson continued. "You belong on that stage just as much as anyone." "What do you say?" Thomas thought about his father, who'd given up his guitar and died with music locked inside him. He thought about his mother, who'd fought until her last breath to make sure her son didn't make the same mistake. "I say yes," Thomas said, smiling through tears. That Saturday, Thomas taught his first class. 15 students showed up, ranging from age 8 to 65. They sat in folding chairs arranged around the piano, and Thomas taught them the first thing he'd ever learned himself. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." Music doesn't have to be complicated to be beautiful, he told them, his voice